Hello, everyone. My name is Jono Anzalone, and I'm excited to join you throughout the course, beginning with Module 1, Rethinking Disaster Management in a Complex World. As I start to think about my journey as a humanitarian, I'm happy to reflect with you upon some of the initial aha moments that I had and really starting to think about how we rethink the disaster management capabilities in response, recovery, mitigation, the full disaster cycle in this complex world. I started as a Red Cross volunteer in Omaha, Nebraska back in 1993, and I had an incredible privilege of growing my career within emergency management and leading disaster and crisis response across 30 countries with the Red Cross, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as with the private sector, which I'll talk about a little bit more. This course really starts with a bold challenge from Dr. Diego to really rethink how disaster management functions. And for me, that reflection's been a lifelong journey from responding to home fires with the Red Cross back in the early 1990s to really thinking about how we confront global health emergencies, having deployed to Liberia for the Ebola crisis, as well as most recently with COVID. When I first joined the Red Cross, disaster management really showing up after something bad had happened, providing food, clothing, and shelter. And I noticed over time, as I grew my understanding of these complex systems, I began to see the disasters weren't just an event. It was really a system that allowed for people to see some of their most vulnerable times in the places in which they lived. In Omaha, Nebraska, the community that I grew up in, the neighborhoods hit hardest were low income, mostly uninsured, and disproportionately communities of color. And that taught me early on around how disasters expose and really worsen existing inequities. So when I think about some of the examples that have shaped my experience, I'll never forget during Hurricane Katrina, this really showed me it's not just a storm or a hurricane, it was really a systems failure. When we look at the interconnectivity or relationships between racism and poverty, poor intersection colliding with slow and fragmented government response, we really start to see the different components of the system that collide. I remember one specific evacuee that was flown into Omaha on many of the flights that were taking place across the United States. And this woman arrived in Omaha thinking that she was going to Alaska and not Nebraska. And it really, for her, was a frightening experience, never having traveled outside of Louisiana and really coming to a place that she had never been to, different cultural context, and overall, a frightening experience. I also think about the shelter in which I was managing, in which a trans woman was in a binary shelter system and felt psychologically unsafe, physically unsafe, as the systems weren't built to kind of think beyond the binary, and certainly in ways that might be different than many of the disaster responders were used to. And moments like this made it clear to me in my career that we can't separate the human experience from the systematic vulnerabilities that really shape it. So when I moved into international humanitarian response with the Red Cross, I'll never forget how clearly it became that these nested elements of political, ecological, and economic systems were really intertwined. My first international deployment was to Belize in 2005, and I worked alongside community volunteers, international agencies after a major hurricane. And while aid coordination was crucial, probably the easiest part of the job, frankly, what mattered most was trusting local knowledge and really understanding some of the root causes and not just the symptoms of that particular hurricane response. I think a large part of where I evolved early on in my career is really thinking about longer term actions, anticipatory actions, resilience building, and equity that aren't nice to haves. They're not just if funding's available or if we have a subject matter expert, but really the essential elements that underpin the entire ecosystem in which I was working as an emergency manager. And disaster managers like me today don't just need technical skills. I'm very proud that I know how to run a shelter, I know how to do water and sanitation operations, cash transfer programs. But the ethical clarity that's needed is equally as important, if not more, and the ability to really navigate competing worldviews. My most recent international post was in Panama during the pandemic and pre-pandemic, and as head of disaster and crisis for the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, I saw governments ignore warnings. I saw the human cost of politicized public health, but I also saw the power of principled leadership and humanity and dignity. I was fortunate to work for a regional director, Walter Cote, who was a lifelong humanitarian who really gave me courage and really pronounced that ethical clarity that's needed to manage complex disasters. So, kind of thinking about how we're all part of this humanitarian machine, Dr. Diego, one of his great books that he wrote and edited was on how ethical leadership really manifests itself in many different ways. So, a large question that I often ask myself is, are we perpetuating inequity or are we interrupting it? So hopefully this first module is an invitation for you to zoom out, like I try to do periodically, to see disasters not just as one-time events, but as complex outcomes of broken systems. So as you're stepping into your roles, remember, myself included, leadership is a field that requires more than coordination, more than technical skill. It required courage, systems thinking, and an unwavering commitment to humanity. So you're not just learning disaster response in the course, you're preparing to shape a more just and resilient world. And I look forward to accompanying you throughout each of the modules with my reflections. Take care, everyone.